Hi, I'm Gary White for Central Kentucky Television. I'm here with Bernie Lubbers, who is a whiskey professor with the Jim Beam organization and was our speaker for the Marion County Chamber of Commerce today. And tell us a little about what you were telling the people at the luncheon today.
Oh,
about
gosh. Yeah.
Whiskey.
Yeah. Well, you know, whiskey and bourbon have such a great history. You can't separate the history of the United States from the history of bourbon. You really can't. And so, from one of our major distillers back in the late 1700s of George Washington, who was making whiskey around the same time that Jacob Beam and all the other little guys out here, to bourbon today is one of the top growing spirits around the world. It's just hard to separate that. So there's great fascinating stories and so much history. I just touched on a little bit today, and I could have talked for another 2 hours on it. So, but it's really cool.
Well, you are a whiskey professor.
Yes.
And tell us, how does one become a whiskey professor?
Well, I'm not going to tell you, because then you might want to be one and I'll lose my job. But you know, we called it a whiskey professor. I kind of helped create this job because Fred Noe, Jim Beam's great-grandson, he was the bourbon ambassador and also our master distiller. He travels the world, and he's got the family history and heritage. I mean, he is a Beam, so he has those stories, and I'm not a Beam, and I don't have those stories. So I had to, you know, I'm not a master distiller, but we wanted to create a job title that showed that we were continuing to learn about bourbon. Had great passion for it, and born and raised here in Kentucky, so always been around bourbon and all around it. So, and bourbon is something you don't learn overnight. It takes you a lifetime. So that kind of took the pressure off me too, for I was like, don't worry, you don't learn it all in a day, and you don't learn it all in 5 or 10 years. This is a lifelong thing. So that really did take the pressure off it. So we called it Whiskey Professor because I go around and I teach people the differences between whiskey and bourbon, and talk about how we make bourbon and the differences. I teach people how to read a bourbon label, which is very helpful, and things like that.
So a lot of studying, I'm sure, went into becoming a professor.
Lots of study, especially there at UK. lots of late night studying going on.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you said one of the first questions, and you said is the question they get asked most, is what is the difference between whiskey and bourbon?
Yes. Whiskey is the broad category. So you have whiskey can be made anywhere in the world. You know, we have Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey. There's local whiskeys made in South America as well as India. But whiskey can be made from any grain anywhere in the world. Distilled up to any proof, like a vodka, like to 190 proof, if you wish. Whiskey does, though, have to be aged in oak. So that distinguishes it from vodkas and other clear spirits. So it does have to be aged in oak. And whiskey has to have all the characteristics attributed to whiskey, which means it must look, smell, and taste like whiskey. And to do that, you can add caramel colors, flavors, and sugars to whiskeys. And a lot of them do, like the blended whiskeys, like a Seagram 7 or a Kessler or something like that. They're younger whiskeys that have had a little help, if you will. Then you got bourbon. And bourbon's a much different animal. Bourbon is not just any grain. It's the majority grain of corn. That's the native crop of North America. It can't be distilled to any proofs. Anything has to be distilled under 160 proof. But just know that it's lower. And the lower that you distill something, the more flavors you retain in there from those grains. The higher you distill something, the more you get out, like vodkas. So bourbon must be distilled at lower proofs. Can't just be aged in any kind of oak. It has to be brand new and charred every single time. So we have to use a brand new barrel every single time. And then bourbon cannot have anything added to it other than water. So we can't add colors and flavors and sugars. And the last, and one of the most important, is that bourbon must be made in the United States of America.
Okay. Now, you've actually written a book on this subject.
Yes. I wrote a book called Bourbon Whiskey, Our Native Spirit. The first edition sold out. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you. The second edition will be out in July or August. And under the same title, Bourbon Whiskey, Our Native Spirit. You can get it on BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon.com, and several Louisville, like Carmichael's bookstore in Louisville, and a few others around Kentucky. So
when do we start introducing you as best-selling author, Bernie Lubbers?
Already, because
okay, there you go.
because when I was in New Orleans doing the book signing, it was in the top 20 of sales that month. In New Orleans, so I'll just go ahead and say it's best-selling.
There you go.
Because I got a letter that said it.
That's correct. There you go.
And I always wondered how that worked, because how are you best-selling when I've never even heard of it? But it's in certain markets, and you know, not Stephen King here, but when you do, like if you sell 20 books in one signing, you've outsold most books in that area, and so that's how they get the bestseller list. So that's kind of fun. So it's like the Billboard charts. They have a list from those book companies. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. Some of the other stories you might learn in this book, or what I found very interesting, is how you said it was kind of accidental that that bourbon got its coloring and got its aging.
And its name.
And its name, exactly right, its name.
Yeah, Bourbon was the county. Bourbon, the Bourbons were the French royal family that helped us in the Revolutionary War. And we didn't have a lot of money to pay them back, so we just named stuff after them. So we named the fourth county in Kentucky was named Bourbon County, just like Bourbon Street was named Bourbon Street after the royal family in New Orleans, because it's a very French city. It was Bourbon County. So that was what appeared on all the barrels as they came out of the port in Bourbon County, which is Maysville, up there where Rosemary Clooney and her are from. And when the bourbon got down into those ports, the little distillers like Jacob Beam and other folks that didn't have a lot of money, like George Washington did, who used a brand new barrel and just shipped it to the army, they had to buy a used barrel and sterilize that barrel by scraping the inside and lighting it on fire. And they thought it was just going to sterilize the barrel so it would receive the whiskey, but it also changed that whiskey and made it that red amber color. Gave it a little bit more of those sugar notes because of that charred barrel. And a lot of magical things happen. As we know, bourbon starts out clear, ends up after several years of aging. But the 9 months it took to get down to the port, a magical thing happened. It turned into red, amber whiskey. And he looked on the side of that barrel and he said, "What's the name of this? We want more of it because it tastes real good." And it said Old Kentucky Bourbon, which was the port, and whiskey was the product. And they said, "We like that bourbon whiskey from Kentucky." So it's got its name, color, and flavor all by mistake.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I like, too, how you tied in, this is Memorial Day weekend that we're going into, and actually bourbon was kind of patriotic along the way, in the way that it got spread across the whole world, but also that back in the, I think you said it was the 30s or so, that FDR, with the barrels, was helping to create local jobs, and that's kind of one of the requirements for being bourbon.
I'm sure that the Obama would love to have something to be able to create something like what they did back in 1936. It's part of the New Deal under FDR, and there was a lot of lobbying, I'm sure, going on by the Coopers unions and the Cooperages themselves, but they got written into law that you must use a brand new charred barrel every single time, which means we can only use it once, so we're going to have to buy another barrel. So all those jobs were protected, and as long as bourbon was being made, there were jobs. You were always going to have guaranteed a job. And we love that law. A lot of people don't like to be regulated by the government, a lot of industries. We do because it protects our patent. So you can't just make bourbon everywhere. As I said, CNN sent a crew down just a few weeks ago because a lot of folks who have been real successful have been outsourcing jobs. Well, no matter how successful we become at the distilleries here in Kentucky, we can't outsource the jobs outside the United States. We could move it from Kentucky, and we wouldn't because we have the great water here with the limestone shelf. We got the 4 different seasons. There's a lot of reasons why we keep it here. But we can't take those jobs and outsource them. So that's a good thing.
That's great. Yeah. Well, again, I've been talking with Bernie Lubbers, who is a whiskey professor for Jim Beam. Are you the only professor?
Right now, I'm the only professor. It's myself and Fred Noe, Jim Beam's great-grandson, who's our bourbon ambassador and master distiller. So right now, it's just me.
Maybe you'll have a degree in it.
I hope so. Get a doctorate.
Maybe you can teach people how to become a professor
there you go,
of whiskey.
Man.
That's right.
We'll do it. Tune in next time for that.
That's right. But if you want to learn more, you can get the book. Again, where can they get the book in the name?
BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon.com. It's Bourbon Whiskey, Our Native Spirit. And I also have a website called www.whiskeyprof with 1F.com. And you can learn a lot more about bourbon on that site.
And we want to close with, I got some video during the luncheon. Actually, Bernie has written a pledge.
Yeah, the Bourbon Pledge. It's the native spirit of the United States. We should all be as most people in Kentucky are very proud and honored to have bourbon in their history and their heritage. But as I travel the country, it's nice to spread that pride, that Kentucky pride. So I wrote the Bourbon Pledge, and we usually finish our dinners and meetings with that. So we kind of take the pledge. So. And here are all the people from the Marion County Chamber of Commerce luncheon, where Bernie was the speaker today, doing the Bourbon Pledge. This being Gary White for Central Kentucky Television.
suburban.